The flickering neon sign of the Lone Star gas station hummed with a dying electrical buzz, casting rhythmic, sickly green shadows across the cracked pavement of the rural outskirts. At 2:00 a.m., the air was a suffocating blanket of humid heat, saturated with the pungent metallic tang of diesel and the stagnant scent of the surrounding pine woods. In the center of this desolate stage sat a matte black tactical SUV, its high-tech silhouette looking like a fallen monolith against the crumbling, white-painted brick of the old service station. The vehicle was silent, its engine ticking as it cooled, while the overhead fluorescent tubes rattled in the wind, creating an atmosphere of heavy, expectant dread. This was a place where the modern world met the forgotten rural past, and the collision was about to become violent. Officer Silas "the Hammer" Vance pulled his patrol cruiser into the station with a predatory slow roll, the gravel crunching loudly under his tires like breaking bone. He was a man built of dense muscle and unearned arrogance, his duty vest overflowing with extra pouches and tactical gear that served more as a costume of intimidation than a necessity of the job. Vance thrived on the isolation of this zip code, viewing himself as the sole arbiter of justice in a town that had long ago stopped questioning his rough methods. As he stepped out, his boots hit the ground with the deliberate weight of a king surveying a conquered territory, his eyes narrowing as they landed on the expensive out-of-state vehicle. To Vance, wealth in the hands of an outsider was an automatic confession of guilt. Inside the SUV, Senior Chief Elias Thorne sat with the disciplined stillness of a man who had spent a third of his life in the dark corners of the world. His lean, scarred face was partially illuminated by the dim glow of the dashboard, his 1,000-yard stare fixed on the rearview mirror with a calm that most people would find unsettling. Beside him sat a secure, encrypted military briefcase, a Level 4 asset containing biometric data that was never meant to see the light of day in a place like this. Thorne was exhausted, his body aching from a mission that had already spanned 3 continents, but his mind remained sharp and analytical. He didn't want a confrontation. He wanted the quiet anonymity of the night so he could finish his duty to the country. Vance marched toward the driver's side window, his hand resting heavily on his holster in a blatant display of aggression meant to provoke a reaction. "License and registration, and step out of the vehicle so I can see what you're hiding in the back," he barked, his voice a gravelly snarl that echoed off the metal canopy. Thorne didn't flinch, lowering the window just enough to slide his military ID through the gap, his movements slow and non-threatening. "Officer, I am on official Department of Defense business under a dark move protocol," Thorne explained with a chilling neutrality. "By federal law, I cannot exit this vehicle or allow an inspection of the cargo without a command-level authorization. Please verify my credentials with your supervisor before this goes any further." The refusal hit Vance like a physical slap, his ego instantly surging to a boiling point at the perceived defiance of his absolute local authority. He didn't even look at the ID, instead slapping it away into the dirt and reaching through the window to unlatch the door from the inside. "I don't care if you're the president's personal gardener. In this county, I'm the law, and you're just another drug runner with a fancy story," Vance roared, his face turning a dark, dangerous crimson. He grabbed Thorne by the tactical jacket, dragging the Tier 1 operator out into the humid night air with a rough, uncoordinated strength. The contrast was stark. The burly, shouting sergeant exerting every ounce of his bullying power against the lean, silent professional who remained remarkably limp. With a grunt of exertion, Vance tackled Thorne onto the oily pavement, pinning the veteran's face against the grit while reaching into the SUV to grab the encrypted briefcase. In his frantic attempt to find the drugs, Vance slammed the briefcase against the pavement, the reinforced latch snapping with a sharp electronic crack that signaled the breach of a federal seal. As the seal broke, a tiny crimson light on the side of the case began to pulse with a rapid rhythmic heartbeat, a silent distress signal already screaming across classified frequencies. Vance laughed, unaware that he had just triggered a tectonic shift in the night's power dynamic. He threw the suspect toward his cruiser, satisfied with his dominance, while Thorne simply watched him with a look of profound, silent pity. Are you liking this story? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now we continue with the video. The interior of the patrol car smelled of stale coffee and the heavy metallic scent of Vance's unwashed tactical gear. As the cruiser sped toward the small-town station, Silas Vance kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see fear or desperation etched on his prisoner's face. Instead, Senior Chief Elias Thorne sat in the shadows of the back seat with a haunting, statuesque composure, his eyes fixed on the dark tree line passing by. Thorne's mind drifted back to the dusty outskirts of Kandahar and the frozen ridges of the Hindu Kush, places where true life-and-death decisions were made in heartbeats. Compared to the real monsters he had faced in the service of his country, this sergeant was nothing more than a loud, insecure shadow. Thorne felt a deep, weary sadness for the man driving the car, a man who had clearly forgotten that his badge was a shield for the weak, not a club for the arrogant. "You're awfully quiet for a guy who's about to spend the rest of his life in a state cage," Vance sneered, his voice booming in the cramped cabin to fill the silence that made him uncomfortable. He adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles white with the adrenaline of the arrest he was already planning to brag about at the local diner. He envisioned the local headlines, casting himself as the hero who intercepted a major black market courier on a lonely stretch of highway. Vance had spent 15 years building a reputation as the Hammer, a title he wore like armor to hide the fact that he had never actually left the safety of his home county. He relied on the ignorance of the townspeople to maintain his status, but in the back of his mind, a small, nagging voice warned him that Thorne's silence wasn't the silence of a criminal. It was the silence of a professional. Thorne finally spoke, his voice low and devoid of any malice, which only served to make the atmosphere more chilling. "Officer, I need you to listen very carefully, because your window for a peaceful resolution is closing," he began, his tone that of a teacher explaining a dangerous chemical reaction to a reckless student. "You didn't just arrest a man tonight. You interfered with a Level 4 national security asset. That briefcase has a tamper response beacon that has already alerted the Pentagon and the Joint Special Operations Command." Thorne leaned forward as much as the partition allowed, his eyes locking onto Vance's in the mirror with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. "You have exactly 10 minutes before the sky falls on this town. Call your sheriff, tell him the truth, and maybe you'll keep your pension. If you don't, you're looking at the end of your life as you know it." Vance let out a forced, boisterous laugh that sounded hollow even to his own ears, shaking his head as if he were watching a bad movie. "The Pentagon? JSOC? You've got a hell of an imagination. I'll give you that, Chief," he mocked, using the title like a slur. "I've heard it all before. CIA, undercover FBI, sovereign citizens. Everyone has a fancy story once the cuffs go on. But that suitcase is going to stay in my evidence locker until I can pry it open and show the world what you're really hauling." He ignored the red pulsing light on the floorboard of the passenger seat, convincing himself it was just a low battery indicator or some cheap electronic gimmick designed to scare off thieves. Vance was tripling down on his ego, his pride serving as a blindfold that prevented him from seeing the massive federal machinery he had just accidentally activated. They arrived at the aging red brick police station, a building that looked more like a fortified bunker than a public service center. Vance dragged Thorne through the back entrance, bypassing the night dispatcher with a gruff wave of his hand that signaled he didn't want any witnesses yet. He threw Thorne into a small, windowless holding cell that smelled of bleach and old sweat, the iron bars clanging shut with a finality that would have broken a lesser man. Thorne didn't pace or complain. He simply sat on the wooden bench and closed his eyes, mentally preparing for the extraction he knew was coming. He wasn't worried about himself. He was worried about the biometric data in the briefcase and the young technicians at the secure facility who were currently scrambling to track his location. He knew the protocols for a breached Level 4 asset, and they were never subtle. In the processing room, Vance cleared his desk and placed the matte black briefcase in the center, looking at it with a mixture of greed and growing anxiety. He picked up a heavy-duty screwdriver and a crowbar, determined to crack the illegal prize before his sheriff arrived for the morning shift. The red light was now blinking faster, a steady, rhythmic heartbeat that seemed to pulse in sync with the rising tension in the room. Every time Vance tried to wedge the crowbar into the seam, a high-pitched, almost ultrasonic whine emitted from the case, a warning he chose to interpret as a sign of his impending success. He was sweating now, the humidity of the night and the pressure of his own choice weighing on him, though he still refused to acknowledge the magnitude of the disaster he was courting in the name of his own vanity. The local sheriff, a weary man named Miller who had spent 30 years trying to keep Vance's temper in check, walked into the station after being alerted by the night dispatcher about a high-speed arrest. He stood in the doorway of the processing room, his eyes widening as he saw the high-tech briefcase and the frantic look on his sergeant's face. "Silas, what the hell are you doing?" Miller asked, his voice low and filled with an immediate, gut-wrenching suspicion. "The dispatcher said you pulled over a black SUV. Where's the driver, and where did that case come from?" Miller had seen enough in his long career to know when a situation was drifting into dangerous waters, and the sight of the pulsing red light on the briefcase made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He could sense that Vance had finally crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Vance didn't look up, his face set in a mask of stubborn defiance as he struggled with the briefcase's reinforced hinges. "Just another runner, Sheriff. Claimed he was some kind of Navy SEAL, but he wouldn't let me search the vehicle, so I brought him in for resisting," Vance grunted, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. "Once I get this thing open, you'll see I was right. Probably carrying enough fentanyl to kill half the state." Miller walked over to the cell block and looked through the bars at Thorne, who sat in perfect silence, his eyes still closed. The sheriff saw the scars on the man's hands and the quiet dignity of his posture, and he felt a cold lump of dread form in his stomach. He knew right then that Vance hadn't caught a criminal. He had caught a nightmare that was about to wake up the entire town. "Silas, stop. Put the tools down right now," Miller ordered, his voice trembling slightly as he realized the gravity of the mistake his sergeant had made. "Look at him. That man isn't a drug runner. Look at the way he carries himself. You need to let him out, and we need to call the state police before this gets any worse." But Vance was beyond listening. His ego had completely taken the wheel, and the thought of being proven wrong in front of his superior was more terrifying than any legal consequence. He ignored the order, instead slamming the screwdriver into the lock with a desperate, frantic energy. He was convinced that if he could just find one piece of incriminating evidence, he could justify everything: the assault, the illegal search, and the blatant violation of protocol. He was a man drowning in his own pride, pulling everyone else down with him. Suddenly, the station's flickering overhead lights died completely, plunging the room into a thick, suffocating darkness that was only broken by the frantic red pulse of the briefcase. The constant hum of the air conditioner and the buzzing of the computers fell silent, leaving the building in an eerie, unnatural stillness that made Vance's heart hammer against his ribs. He reached for his flashlight, but as he clicked the button, nothing happened. It was as if the very air had become an electronic vacuum. Outside, the crickets and frogs of the rural night had gone silent, and a strange, heavy vibration began to rattle the windowpanes of the station. It wasn't the sound of a storm. It was the low-frequency thrum of heavy machinery moving through the sky, a sound that signaled the arrival of a force that didn't care about local zip codes or small-town authority. Miller stumbled toward the front window, peeling back the blinds to look out into the street. "The cell service is gone, Silas. My phone is a brick," the sheriff whispered, his face pale in the red glow of the distress beacon. He looked up at the sky and saw the stars being blotted out by massive dark shapes that hummed with a power that made the ground tremble. 2 Black Hawk helicopters, running without lights, were hovering directly over the station, their rotors kicking up a cyclonic wind that tore the shingles off the roof and sent gravel flying through the air like shrapnel. The sky had indeed fallen, and the 10 minutes Thorne had promised had just expired. The station was now the center of a military-grade cordon, and the small-town hammer was about to find out what it felt like to be the nail. Vance stood frozen in the middle of the room, the crowbar still in his hand, looking like a child caught in a forbidden act. He heard the sound of tires screeching on the asphalt outside, and the heavy metallic clack of doors being thrown open. Through the front lobby, he could see the beams of dozens of high-intensity tactical lights cutting through the darkness, illuminating the swirling dust and debris. There was no shouting, no sirens, just the efficient, terrifyingly quiet movements of a professional extraction team. The patriot in Vance wanted to believe these were his people, but as he saw the silhouettes of men in full combat gear and night vision goggles breaching the front entrance, he realized with a sickening jolt that he was the enemy they were coming for. His unearned authority was evaporating in the heat of a real-world tactical response. The front doors of the station were kicked off their hinges with a single, synchronized breach that sent a cloud of splinters into the lobby. A dozen federal agents and SOCOM operators flooded the building, their suppressed rifles leveled with surgical precision as they cleared every corner of the room in seconds. A tall man in a desert camo uniform, wearing the silver eagles of a colonel on his collar, walked through the chaos with a calm that matched Thorne's. He didn't look at the sheriff or the frozen sergeant. He walked straight to the holding cells, his boots clicking on the concrete floor with a sound that felt like a death knell for Vance's career. The colonel stopped in front of Thorne's cell, and without a word, he snapped a crisp, razor-sharp salute through the iron bars, a gesture of profound respect that made the entire room feel smaller. "Senior Chief, apologies for the delay. We had some trouble with the local interference," the colonel said, his voice a calm, resonant baritone that carried the weight of the entire Department of Defense. Thorne stood up, his posture once again that of a Tier 1 operator, and offered a slight, knowing nod to his commanding officer. "Mission is still secure, Colonel, but the seal on the asset has been breached by that man over there," Thorne replied, pointing a steady finger toward Vance, who was still clutching the crowbar like a pathetic souvenir. The colonel turned his gaze toward Vance, and for the first time in his life, the hammer felt the true meaning of fear. It wasn't the fear of a fight. It was the fear of a man who realized he was completely and utterly insignificant in the face of real power. Two federal marshals stepped forward, their faces like stone as they moved toward Vance with a set of heavy-duty restraints. They didn't ask for his cooperation. They simply took it, disarming him and forcing him to his knees in one fluid, practiced motion. "Sergeant Silas Vance, you are being detained under the Espionage Act for the unauthorized tampering of Level 4 classified materials and the assault of a federal officer on active duty," one of the marshals stated, his voice devoid of any emotion. Vance tried to speak, to offer some excuse about protecting the town. But the words died in his throat as he looked at the shattered briefcase on his desk. He had spent his life bullying people with a badge, and now that same law was being used to crush him with the weight of a 1,000-year-old oak tree. The colonel watched as his men carefully placed the briefcase into a lead-lined containment bag, their movements as delicate as if they were handling an unexploded bomb. He then looked at Sheriff Miller, who was standing in the corner with his hands raised in a gesture of total surrender. "Sheriff, your department is now under federal oversight. Every file, every body camera, and every arrest record from the last 10 years will be reviewed by the Department of Justice," the colonel announced, his words landing like hammer blows on the future of the town. "This isn't just about one man's ego. It's about a culture that allowed a man like Vance to believe he was above the law he swore to protect." Miller simply nodded, knowing that the hammer had finally broken the very foundation of the community he claimed to serve. As the federal agents began to funnel out of the station, carrying the mission-critical data and the disgraced sergeant, Thorne walked out of the holding cell, a free man once again. He stopped for a moment in front of Vance, who was now weeping silently on the floor, his tactical vest looking like a ridiculous costume in the harsh glare of the federal lights. "I told you the sky was going to fall, Silas," Thorne said softly, his voice filled with a genuine heartbreaking pity. "You could have been a part of the service, but you chose to be the obstacle. I hope the next 50 years give you enough time to figure out the difference." Thorne walked out into the cool night air, leaving the ruined station behind, his mission finally nearing its end as he boarded the waiting Black Hawk. Outside, the townspeople were beginning to wake up, peeking through their curtains at the sight of military helicopters and federal vehicles clogging their quiet streets. They didn't see the hammer protecting them. They saw a man being led away in shame, his mask of authority finally stripped away to reveal the hollow insecurity underneath. The dark move was over, but the light it had shone on the corruption of the local police would burn for years to come. Thorne watched from the open door of the helicopter as the rural landscape fell away beneath him, his thoughts already turning toward his family and the peace he had fought so hard to maintain. He was a predator who had chosen restraint, while Vance was a bully who had chosen ruin, and the night had finally rendered its verdict on both. Are you liking this story? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now we continue with the video. The police station lobby was no longer a local office. It had been transformed into a cold, tactical command center where every shadow was illuminated by the relentless glare of federal authority. As the federal marshals forced Silas Vance to his knees, The heavy clatter of his dropped crowbar echoed like a final, pathetic plea against the concrete floor. The SOCOM colonel stood over him, not with the heat of anger, but with the chilling, absolute detachment of a man delivering a mathematical certainty. Vance's face was pressed against the same grit where he had pinned Thorne hours earlier, the irony of the situation tasting like copper and shame in his mouth. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot and pleading, searching for a flicker of recognition or mercy in the faces of the operators who surrounded him. But there was only the silent, professional disgust of men who truly knew what it meant to bleed for a flag. "Colonel, please. I thought I was protecting my town from a threat." "I didn't know who he was," Vance stammered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine that betrayed every ounce of his fabricated toughness. The arrogance that had fueled the Hammer for 15 years had evaporated, leaving behind a small, frightened man who realized his badge was now a weight dragging him into an abyss. He looked toward Thorne, who stood by the broken door, silhouetted against the rotor wash of the Blackhawks waiting outside. Vance was desperate for a lifeline, for some word of forgiveness that would stop the crushing momentum of the federal machine. He realized, too late, that the man he had tried to humiliate was the only one in the room with the power to see his humanity. Yet he had done everything to forfeit that grace. The colonel ignored Vance's pleas, turning instead to Senior Chief Thorne with a look of profound, quiet appreciation for his unwavering discipline. "Senior Chief, the breach of the Level 4 asset is a catastrophic security event, but your restraint prevented it from becoming a bloodbath," the colonel stated, his voice carrying the weight of a formal commendation. He reached into the containment bag and pulled out Thorne's military ID, which was still dusted with the dirt of the gas station where Vance had thrown it. The colonel wiped it clean with his thumb and handed it back to Thorne, a gesture that felt like the restoring of a king's crown. In that moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, acknowledging the vast, silent ocean of character that separated the two men standing at opposite ends of the law. Thorne took the ID, his hands steady and his gaze fixed on the broken man on the floor, his expression one of deep, mournful contemplation rather than triumph. "Colonel, this man didn't see a soldier because he was too busy looking for a victim to feed his own ego," Thorne said, his voice a low rumble that commanded more attention than Vance's loudest shout. "He's not a threat to the mission anymore, but he's a tragedy to every honest officer who has to wear a uniform after him." The dialogue was a scalpel, cutting through the layers of Vance's self-delusion and exposing the rot of unearned power that had led to this ruinous climax. Thorne wasn't just testifying to a crime. He was delivering a eulogy for a man who had chosen to be a tyrant in a world that desperately needed protectors. Suddenly, Vance began to sob, the sound a ragged, ugly contrast to the rhythmic hum of the helicopters hovering above the station. He looked at his own hands, the hands that had roughed up outsiders and enforced his version of justice, and finally saw them for what they were, tools of a bully. "I just wanted to be respected. I just wanted people to know I was in charge," he wailed, the raw, pathetic truth finally spilling out into the cold room. The federal agents didn't move, their faces remaining impassive as Vance's confession of insecurity filled the space where his pride used to live. It was the ultimate transformation, a moment of soul-crushing realization, where the protagonist saw the wreckage of his life and realized he was the one who had set the fire. The colonel stepped forward, his shadow falling over Vance like a dark, inevitable cloud, and spoke the words that would officially end the era of the Hammer. "You wanted respect, Silas, but you only understood fear. Respect is earned in the silence of service, not in the noise of a takedown," the colonel said, his voice final and cold. "You've spent your life demanding a salute you never deserved, and now you'll spend the rest of it in a federal cell, wondering why no one is coming to save you." The finality of the statement hit Vance like a physical blow, his head dropping to his chest as the reality of a mandatory minimum sentence under the Espionage Act settled over him. The transformation was complete. The king of the zip code was now just a number in a federal ledger. As the marshals began to hoist Vance up to lead him toward the waiting transport, the local sheriff, Miller, stepped forward, his eyes wet with a mixture of anger and profound sorrow. He looked at the badge he had given Vance years ago, now pinned to a chest that was heaving with desperate, useless breath. "I should have stopped you years ago, Silas. I let your pride become our department's cancer, Miller whispered, a moment of shared accountability that added a layer of systemic tragedy to the climax. He reached out and unpinned the badge from Vance's vest, the metal tearing slightly as it came away, leaving a small, jagged hole over the former officer's heart. It was a visual execution of his identity, a stripping away of the mask that had allowed him to terrorize the outskirts for so long. Thorne walked toward the exit, his mission secured and his dignity intact, but he paused at the threshold to look back one last time at the wreckage behind him. He saw the broken briefcase, the shattered door, and the man who had traded his soul for a moment of perceived dominance. The emotional weight of the night was heavy, a reminder that even when the good guys win, there is a cost to the human spirit when authority is so violently misused. He stepped out into the cyclonic wind of the Black Hawks, his tactical jacket fluttering as the first light of dawn began to gray the horizon. The climax had reached its peak, and as the helicopters rose into the sky, they carried with them the remains of a legacy built on pride and the beginning of a long, cold winter for Silas Vance. Sto scrivendu blocco 4. The morning sun finally crested the horizon, painting the rural landscape in a deceptive, peaceful gold that belied the chaos of the night. On the tarmac of a nearby military airfield, Senior Chief Elias Thorne stood by the open ramp of a transport plane, his mission officially handed over to the high-level security team that had met him upon arrival. The biometric data, the Level 4 asset that had sparked the confrontation, was now safely tucked into a permanent federal vault, its secrets preserved by the very restraint Thorne had displayed. He took a long, deep breath of the cool morning air, feeling the physical and mental weight of the dark move finally lift from his shoulders. His face, though still etched with the weariness of the journey, carried a serene clarity. He had defended more than just data. Isle had defended the principle that true power lies in the hands of those who refuse to abuse it. The systemic resolution in the small town was swift and surgical, leaving no stone unturned in the pursuit of a corrected justice. Within 48 hours of the incident, the Department of Justice had frozen all local police records, initiating a comprehensive civil rights investigation that would eventually lead to the dismissal of 3 other officers who had enabled Vance's reign of terror. The town's residents, initially shocked by the military presence, began to speak out about years of suppressed grievances, finding their voices once the shadow of the hammer was removed from their streets. The city council issued a formal public decree of apology to Thorne and the Department of Defense, accompanied by a commitment to rebuild their law enforcement from the ground up. This was not just a legal victory, but a moral cleansing for a community that had lived under the heel of an ego-driven tyrant for far too long. 1 month later, Elias Thorne returned to the town, not as a fugitive or a prisoner, but as a guest of honor at the local high school's commencement ceremony. He stood on the gymnasium stage, dressed in a simple, respectful suit, looking out at a sea of young faces who were eager to hear from the man who had brought down a legend. He didn't speak of the violence or the helicopters. Instead, he focused his message on the true meaning of service, emphasizing that a badge or a uniform is a debt to the public, not a license for arrogance. He spoke about the sanctity of the law and the fact that no individual, regardless of their rank or status, is ever above the foundational principles of human dignity. The students listened in a silence so profound it felt like a collective promise, a moment where the town's future began to shift toward a legacy of genuine respect. Silas Vance's transition from local king to federal inmate was documented in a series of grim, unceremonious court appearances that stripped away every remaining layer of his pride. He was found guilty of multiple counts of felony assault, civil rights violations, and the high-stakes charge of felony tampering with classified materials under the Espionage Act. The judge, a woman known for her uncompromising stance on official misconduct, noted that Vance had turned his community into a fiefdom and his office into a playground for his own insecurities. His sentencing was a landmark event, sending a clear and echoing message to law enforcement agencies across the country. The era of the unchecked ego was over. As he was led out of the courtroom in shackles, the man who had once been the Hammer was now nothing more than a cautionary tale, a broken shell of a man facing decades of silent, lonely reflection. The concrete change in the town was visible in the way the new police force interacted with the public, led by a newly appointed chief who prioritized community engagement over tactical intimidation. The Lone Star gas station, once the site of a violent humiliation, was eventually renovated, its flickering neon lights replaced by a bright, welcoming warmth that symbolized the town's rebirth. Thorne continued his service, eventually moving into a training role where he could instill his values of restraint and humility into the next generation of special operations operators. He often thought back to that humid night at 2:00 a.m., not with bitterness, but with the satisfaction of knowing he had fulfilled his duty in the most difficult way possible. The mission had ended, but the impact of his character continued to ripple through the lives of people he would never even meet. The story concludes with a vision of a world where honor is measured not by the loudness of one's voice, but by the strength of one's silence. True service requires the humility to recognize a hero, even when they don't look like the version of one you've created in your mind. Thorne's legacy became a beacon for others, proving that the silent power of duty will always eventually unmask the fragility of unearned authority. As the rural town settled into its new era of transparency and fairness, the memory of the hammer faded into a dark footnote, while the lesson of the senior chief remained a guiding light. The message was clear and final. Pride is a blindfold that leads to ruin, but the truth, upheld with integrity, is the only force capable of truly protecting the people. Have they made any gesture of kindness that changed a life? Leave a little heart if you believe that love is more powerful than any wealth. Subscribe for more second chance stories. Comment "Love is priceless" if you also believe in human union. A news report flickers on a small television in a quiet roadside diner. The anchor's voice steady as she recounts the final sentencing of Silas Vance. The screen shows a grainy, high-angle shot of Vance being escorted into the gates of a maximum security federal penitentiary, his head bowed and his hammer persona completely shattered. He has been sentenced to 58 years without the possibility of early release. A staggering weight for a man who once thought he owned the world. The diner is quiet, the local patrons watching the screen with a mixture of relief and somber reflection. In the final shot of the segment, we see a brief, candid photo of Senior Chief Elias Thorne during a training exercise. He is looking at a small, worn photograph of his family, his face finally at peace. He is back in the shadows where he belongs, serving a country that will never truly know the depth of the disaster he averted.